Good evening, everybody. This week we will be studying Parshat Korach, and hopefully next week we'll all catch up and be on the same page in terms of the Parsha. But especially for the people in Chutz La'aretz, I'd actually like to begin with the end of Parshat Shlach. And that is the section that has to do with tzitzit, which is the third section of the Shema. And in particular, I want to look at one verse. So if you turn to this is chapter 15, verse 39. It says in the middle of the verse, V'lo taturu acharei levavchem v'acharei einechem asher atem zonim achareihem, which is that you should not go after your heart and your eyes, which you are led astray by. For those people who were with me last week, so it's actually very interesting how that verse complements the beginning of the parsha, where the mission of the spies is v'yaturu et Eretz Canaan, that they should check it out, examine it carefully. But here it speaks about lo taturu acharei levavchem v'acharei nechem. Many years ago, the former president of Pardes, Rabbi Danny Landis, gave a Dvar Torah in the name of his grandfather. And he was bothered by the fact that what it should say is you shouldn't be led astray, or you shouldn't look after your eyes and your heart, with the idea being first you see something and then you experience it, okay? And then you draw various implications, or draw inferences, I should say. But what he said was that the fact that it mentions your heart before your eyes is because people essentially very often see things the way they would like to see it, and not what objectively it is. And as a result, what the Torah is saying is when you look at various things, be very careful that you're not led astray and that your heart is pushing you in a certain direction. By the way, I just want to point out, although I just thought about this earlier today and I haven't, checked this out fully. If you're familiar with the first paragraph, it's in the Shema, it says you should love God with b'chol levavcha. And there are two bets in the word, the letter bet. So there's a rabbinic interpretation which says you should love God with both your hearts. And by adding the extra bet, it's saying love God not only with your good inclination, but with your evil inclination. It would actually be very be very interesting, I should say, to check out if every time the word levav, lamed bet bet appears, if that actually might be somehow alluding to one's evil inclination. And so that in the first paragraph of the Shema, it says, love God even with your evil inclination. And in this third paragraph of the Shema, it's saying, don't follow your evil inclination in how you look at things. Now, I'm bringing this point up because I think it's not only a closure to last week's Parshat Shlach, and we discussed this a little bit in terms of how the spies look at the land of Israel, but I think it's going to be an introduction to the story of Korach. And that's what I would like to look at today, what is generally known as Korach's rebellion. And in fact, what I would suggest is that what happens in Parshat Korach, in certain ways, is maybe the worst sin of the Jewish people in the desert. I might even say the most pernicious sin. We're all familiar with the sin of the golden calf and the sin of the spies. And yet on a certain level, the sin of Korach is actually much worse. And that's what I would like to explain, and also perhaps apply to certain things that are happening in our reality today. So let's begin. This is chapter 16, Parashat Bamidbar. So it says, Vayikach Korach ben Yitzhar ben Kahat ben Levi, v'Datan v'Aviram b'nei Eliyav, Yom ben Pelet b'nei Ruvain. Korach takes Datan and Aviram and On ben Pelet. And in fact, what's very interesting here is it mentions three people who are, or actually four, Korach, Datan and Aviram, although I list Datan and Aviram as a unit, On ben Pelet. They are the subject, and it says, but there's a single verb, or I should say a verb in the singular, which is Vayikach Korach. And what it doesn't say is, what did he take? What's the object? Now, it's very interesting. There's a difference of opinion among commentaries. Probably the simplest way of taking it is to say that essentially what Korach, or who Korach is taking, is what appears in the next verse. When it speaks about 250 people from the community who are now going to join him in his confrontation with Moshe. So that the object of Vayikach are the people that he's taking. In fact, you might even make the argument that Korach initially takes Datan and Aviram, On ben Pelet, and eventually 250 people, and then comes before Moshe. And as I said, that would be the simplest way of taking it, that Korach is putting together what today we would probably call a coalition that's in opposition to Moshe. But the Ramban Nachmanides has a different explanation, and he wants to argue, and I'm not going to go into the various examples that he gives for this, that in a number of places when it says someone takes, it's actually an expression for taking to heart or looking into your heart. Okay, one might even say thinking about something, planning something before you then act. And therefore, according to the Ramban, what Korach is doing is actually something which is very much premeditated, which is thought out. And now I want to just connect this with how I began the shir, that to a great extent, it's his heart which is prompting him to do what he's about to do. And in effect, what Korach is actually doing is violating what it says in the third paragraph of the Shema, of not going after your heart and after your eyes. So what is it that is happening here? So let's look at Pasuk Bet, verse 2. Vayakumu lifnei Moshe v'anashim ibnei Yisrael 50 u200 nesiei eda kri'ei moed anshe Shem. So the first expression is they rise up before Moshe, which is a very interesting expression. Now, saying that someone is before someone else is an expression of saying that you're in their presence. And very often it might also be an expression of being subordinate to that person. To speak about rising up in their presence might actually be indicative of the fact of what I mentioned earlier, that there is about to be a rebellion which is happening. There is a challenging of the authority of Moshe. Who is doing this? So let me begin with this pasuk and then go back to the original pasuk. 250 men. Okay, but who are these men? Nisi'ei Eda, princes of the congregation. Kri'ei Moed, those people who are called upon for special occasions. Anshe Shem, people that have a name. Now we're using three different expressions to describe how the 250 people here are leaders in the Jewish people, significant personalities. If I go back to the first pasuk, when I'm given Korach, who is Korach? Ben Yitzhar, Ben Kahat, Ben Levi. That's his pedigree, which is in effect saying that Korach is somebody who is also an extremely significant person. And as we actually saw in the beginning of Bamidbar, the Levi'im are given a very, very special status in terms of servicing the Mishkan. They have two separate censuses. And therefore, what I want to say is, what is happening over here, which is why I said this is actually maybe the most pernicious of the sins of the Jewish people, is that whereas in other sins, I could say that the sin essentially is of the masses. It's of the general population who are unhappy about something, who are afraid of something. Over here, what I have is a sin that's being perpetrated by the creme de la creme, the elite of the Jewish people. An elite which, as we will see in a moment, are challenging Moshe's authority and have the capacity to create a tremendous rift within the Jewish people. So now let's look at Pasuk Yimel. Vayikahalu al Moshe al Aharon. They gathered together, and here the nuances of the Hebrew are very important. They gathered together literally on Moshe and Aaron. Now, you should understand that every time you have an expression like that, and you can check it out in a concordance, it always implies what could be called a mob scene. A scene which is very threatening, where you have a group of people gathering on top of somebody. It's like they're asserting themselves above someone else. And I want you to realize this is the inverse of what we might expect in terms of the relationship with Moshe. So already at the outset, we get the sense that what's about to happen is confrontational. And what are they doing? They say the following. Vayomru alehem. They say to Moshe and Aaron, Rav lachem, much to you. Ki chol ha'ida kulam kedoshim. The whole congregation, the whole community are all holy. Uvitocham Hashem, and God is in their midst. Umadua titnasuu al kahal Hashem. And why are you raising yourselves up above the congregation of God? So I would like to begin actually with the end expression, the last thing. Titnasuu, to lift yourselves up. In modern Hebrew, lehitnaseh, to raise oneself up, is generally the expression for hubris, arrogance, pompousness. So that at the very end, what they're doing is accusing Moshe and Aaron of being pompous. Now, we all know that in chapter 12 in Bamidbar, in the famous story where Miriam is speaking about Moshe, the Torah explicitly says that Moshe is the most humble person on earth. So to accuse Moshe of being somebody who is arrogant, who's pompous, is a complete inversion of the reality. To say at the very beginning to Moshe and Aaron, Rav lachem, much to you. It's like, don't you have enough? Do you want to always be more? So the first thing that I want you to see is, if I look at the beginning and I look at the end, what we have over here is actually a personal attack, which is being lodged against Moshe and Aaron. And in the middle, I have something which ostensibly is an ideological point, which is everyone is holy. God is in their midst. So then why are there some people who ostensibly are holier than others? So now if I want to just take what they're saying over here, essentially this is a plug for today, what we would call egalitarianism. Okay? Anti-hierarchical. And what it's saying is, what makes you, okay, puts you on a pedestal above us. Now, as we will see in a moment, essentially what's bothering them, at least in terms of the text, because I want to take this step by step to look at the verses and then see maybe what's beyond that. Essentially, what's bothering them is, why is it that only Aaron is allowed to be the priest? Why is only Aaron given that access to God to be able to have that very intimate I-thou encounter? Why can't everybody do it? Why is there access only to certain people vis-a-vis the Mishkan and everybody else is excluded from that? But everybody is holy. God is in the midst of the whole people. So why make that distinction of different, we might say, classes? There's the class of the priests, the class of the Levites, the class of the general Jewish population, the different camps. Rashi actually makes a very interesting comment here. And this is going to be important for a number of things that we're going to be looking at. When people present a certain argument, and that's exactly what's happening over here, there is a certain argument which is now going on between Korach and his followers and Moshe. There is an issue which is being raised. So it's always important for people to actually ground their issues, I think, in facts, rather than perceptions, rather than slogans. It's very nice to say that everybody's equal and God is in the midst of everybody, but what do you base that on? Well, yes, God is in the midst of everybody because right now in the middle of the camp, there's the tabernacle. The presence of God, okay, is to be found there. Everybody is holy. Well, obviously everybody's holy because we created these encampments around the tabernacle, and we discussed this the past few weeks. But if you recall, I mentioned to you a number of weeks ago in Parashat Bamidbar that the encampment in the desert in certain ways mirrors what was at Mount Sinai. And Rashi here makes a very interesting comment. He says that on what basis is everyone equal? Well, it's on the fact, based on the fact that everyone heard God at Mount Sinai equally. But now the question, is that really true? And I'm sure everybody recalls that, first of all, Moshe goes to the top of the mountain. Everybody else has to stay at the foot of the mountain. But beyond that, when God begins speaking, even before maybe God begins speaking, the people are actually trembling. They're terrified. In the aftermath of the 10 Commandments, the people come to Moshe and say to Moshe, you speak to God. We don't want to have God speak to us. We're afraid that we're going to die. So wait a second, not everybody is equal. Moshe had a radically different type of I-thou encounter with God. Aaron was in the middle of the mountain. I would even add, it's not that Moshe took on that role. Moshe was given that role, not only by God, but by the people. So what's going on over here? Why are the people now coming with this claim against Moshe, which actually is, to a certain extent, is a distortion of the facts? So now let's look a little bit further. Vayishma Moshe, verse Pasuk Dalid, and Moshe hears Vayipol al panav. He falls on his face, which is a very interesting expression. We find this in a number of different places. And what does it mean he falls on his face? And here again, there is a difference of opinion among certain commentaries. Certain commentaries say Moshe falls on his face, you might say, as an expression of exasperation. He's frustrated. He doesn't know what to do. He's embarrassed at what the people are now, how they're speaking to him, what they're accusing him of. There are other commentaries who say that he's falling on his face because he's praying to God, asking God for guidance. What should I do? How should I respond to this? And this becomes a very interesting question when Moshe subsequently speaks to the people. Is he actually speaking as Moshe, or is he speaking as the mouthpiece of God? But let's now see what Moshe says. Pasuk Hey, Vayidaber el Korach ve'el kol adato lemor. And Moshe speaks to Korach and to his following. Boker v'yoda Adonai et asher lo ve'et hakadosh v'yikriv elav ve'et asher yivchar bo yakriv elav. So he says to them, in the morning, God will make known who is holy, who is close to him, who he has chosen. And I want to give one explanation of who is holy insofar as who is able to now go and serve God. Who is God chosen? So I want to pick what some commentaries say. The idea of chosenness has implications for forever, for generations. It's not only who is the person that God is choosing, but who is God choosing who will now be handing that role down to all generations. And then what Moshe tells them is, we're going to set up a litmus test. What's the test? The offering of the incense. And we will now see through the offering of the incense who is to be chosen. By the way, Lynn mentioned this last week, I think. The incense is should actually be something that is, should trigger certain memories for the Jewish people. If you go back to chapter 10 in Leviticus, we'll tell the story of Aaron's two sons who bring incense, which was not commanded by God. They died on the spot. Fire comes out and consumes them. So I would assume that for people who have some type of memory of what happened, that would be a little bit daunting, because it could very well be that if I'm now doing the incense offering and it's not exactly acceptable to God, that could be deadly. So maybe you would actually have second thoughts. By the way, I'll just add, that might also be why Moshe says tomorrow morning. I'll give you the night to think about it. So you have an opportunity to still back out. You don't have to actually go through with this. So I want you to see that what Moshe is doing is setting up something which hopefully will be a test, which will be the indicator of what God or who God wants, but it's also giving them the opportunity to respond and perhaps to avoid a confrontation. Now, everything which Moshe has said right now is being said to Korach and his group, his followers. I'll use that term, Korach and his followers. But now look at Pasuk Chet. Moshe then speaks specifically to Korach. And what does he say to him? Shimuna b'nei Levi, listen to me, sons of Levi. I hope everybody realizes that that's a little bit difficult. He's talking to Korach. So why does he address Korach in the plural? Now, you could say that it's using kind of the royal we or the royal you, okay, or the royal third person. Or you could say that Moshe might be addressing Korach as representative of the tribe of Levi, maybe because Korach also, among his followers, has people from the tribe of Levi. And so that, yes, he's speaking to Korach, but this message is also being addressed to the Levi'im in particular, who maybe it's a way of dissuading them of joining Korach, but maybe even more putting a little bit of pressure on Korach to change his position. And what does Moshe say to him? He says, Hama'at mikem, in verse 9, is it too little to you? Ki hivdil Elokei Yisrael etchem me'adat Yisrael, that God separated you from the Jewish people to bring him close to you, to service the tabernacle and to stand before the community. And then we get to the end of verse 10, where Moshe says to him, Ubikashtem gam kuhuna, do you seek out also being priests? So now, when I look at this verse, it all of a sudden puts in perspective, what is it that the people want? And from at least the way the Moshe is framing it, it seems to be that what they would like to do is to be priests. The priests who serve in the Mishkan, who do the actual sacrifices, and in particular, one might even say the incense offering. And what Moshe says to the Leviim is, and to Korach, is it too little that you're a Levi? Is it too little that you in fact do have a role to play in the Mishkan? Do you need to also be Kohanim? Now, I'm going to pause just for one moment because I want to at least connect certain things that I said. Remember, I said to you of not following your heart to be led astray, not following your heart and then your eyes. So over here, look at what's happening. And by the way, this becomes, I think, a theme throughout the Torah. You might even say it's a universal theme, okay, that is true of everyone. How much is it that people constantly focus on what they are, quote unquote, excluded from, on what they're not able to do, as opposed to on what they are able to do? Oh, I can't be the Kohen. If I can't be the Kohen, then forget it. Life is not worth living. But you're a Levi. There's so much that you can do as a Levi. So why is it that you want to be a Kohen? So here I want to now introduce something which clearly, and I say this, is the rabbinic understanding of Korach. And I know, since I see some of the people who are in the audience, so I know there are going to be certain people who immediately are going to say, oh, the rabbis have an axe to grind, right? And that you could read this completely different. I'm happy to hear other opinions. Okay, after the shir, right, stay on. There's a rabbinic opinion, which is taken up by quite a few medieval commentaries as well, that in effect say that essentially what's at work over here with Korach is actually hubris, power. What Korach wants is, and what is motivating Korach is, I want to be the high priest. I want to have that position. I want to have that status. And I might even argue, I want to have that power. The drive for power, okay, as opposed to service of God, is how the rabbis see what's motivating Korach. Now I want to actually take this a step further. This rebellion, when is it happening? And why is it happening? Now, There's an interesting disagreement between Ibn Ezra and between the Ramban, Nachmanides. Ibn Ezra says this whole rebellion is actually happening in the beginning of the book of Bamidbar. And it's a response to the opening chapters of the book of Bamidbar. Namely, in the opening chapters, what we're told is Aaron is the one who's going to be working in the Mishkan. The Levites are to be his assistants. You might say, some people might say his lackeys, okay? And as a result of that, Korach may find it actually very offensive that he is second fiddle. By the way, take it one more step. In chapter 8, when the Levi'im were inducted in their role, they had to have their heads shaved. They were waved. We spoke about this a little bit, which on a certain level could be seen as a little bit of a humiliating experience. Oh, great, I'm a Levite. So that's why they shaved off all my hair. That's why they waved me like a flag. And that's why I have to do all the dirty work, right, to help Aaron. But I don't get to do the cool work, right, to actually do the service of God. So, and then I'll add one other thing. Korach gets together people from the tribe of Ruvain. 250 significant personalities. Well, according to the Ibn Ezra and a few other people, well, the people of Ruvain are unhappy because when they set up the camp, who's going to be leading the camp? Judah. He's the first one who travels. He's the head of the pack. And then we had in chapter 3, the Levites replace the firstborn as the ones who serve in the temple, so that the firstborn are disgruntled, which therefore means I have a number of different groups who are unhappy about how the camp is being set up. On the one hand, I have Aaron, who's given, as I said, this juicy job. The Levites are simply, doing all the dirty work. They have to be the schleppers. I have the firstborn who've been supplanted by the Levites. I have the tribe of Ruvain that's been supplanted by the tribe of Judah. So you have a whole bunch of people who are unhappy about what you might call a certain loss of status. And according to the Ibn Ezra, right, this is all happening, right, actually in the beginning of Bamidbar. And this would follow the Ibn Ezra's general approach, which is there's no chronological sequence to what's going on in the Torah. Interestingly, Nachmanides agrees with the Ibn Ezra in terms of what are the things that actually motivated Korach's rebellion. But Nachmanides says, true to his approach, that this is actually happening now, in real time. It's not out of chronological sequence, which then raises the question, so why are they now raising an issue which they should have raised much earlier? Why did they wait so long? And now I'm paraphrasing Nachmanides, the Ramban. Essentially what Nachmanides says is, Korach could never have done this rebellion earlier, in the beginning of Bamidbar. Because at that point, to use the terminology of today, Moshe's rating in the popularity polls was very high. And if Korach would have tried to somehow challenge Moshe, right, he wouldn't have gotten any backing, any significant backing. So Korach waits. And in fact, if I use slightly, again, different terminology, which Nachmanides doesn't say, but which is my words, Korach is a great politician. He's waiting for the opportunity, the right moment. And this is Nachmanides. He's waiting for Moshe to be low in the popularity rating. And when is that? That's in the aftermath of Parshat Shlach. After the Jewish people sin with the spies, after the Jewish people have been told a whole generation will die in the desert, you could say that at that point, the Jewish people are not exactly happy campers. And the Jewish people may be having second thoughts about Moshe's leadership. And it's at that moment when Moshe's leadership is, I would say, vulnerable. That's when Korach now launches his attack. So that if I take everything and sum it up in terms of this approach, Korach is somebody who's very much motivated by power, by status. Korach is a politician. Korach wants that position, but he has to wait for the opportunity to get backing. And now is that opportunity. And that's when Korach feels that he might be able to actually get the backing of the Jewish people. I might even be so bold as to say, maybe Korach can actually force God's hand to change leadership. Maybe given what's happened, right, in the last 2-3 chapters, maybe God might say, you know what? The Jewish people seem to be going in a downward spiral. Maybe it's time to start changing the leadership. Now, what Moshe is doing is somehow trying to appeal to Korach. But what I want to bring out is that Moshe and Korach are on two very different wavelengths. Now let's look at what Moshe also does. Let's look at verse 12. Moshe then sends to call to Datan and Aviram. Okay, now what I want you to see is the following. What Moshe is doing, okay, one might even say is not actually bad politics. Is if he sees that he has a fledgling rebellion, to in a certain sense, try to divide the different groups, divide and conquer. So essentially what Moshe does is to address different groups in different ways. Okay, to the first group, right, the 250, Moshe says to them, you want to see, is everybody really equally holy? Great, we'll have a test tomorrow. This is the test. Do you want to actually go through with it? Gives them time to think about it. To Korach, Moshe says, why are you pushing to be the priest? Be happy with the fact that you're a Levite. There's a lot that you can do in that capacity. And now there's the third group, which is Datan and Aviram. Moshe sends for them because Moshe would like to talk to them. What's their response? If you look at the language, lo na'aleh, we won't go up. Now that's a very strange expression. For those of you who know Hebrew, what you should say is lo navo, we won't come. But they purposely use the word lo na'aleh, we won't go up. Because who do you think you are, Moshe? We should come to you. You're going to give us orders. So I want you to see that when they use the language lo na'aleh, it echoes what was said earlier, lama titnasa'u. Why do you lift yourselves up above the congregation? And now this is the proof that you people are arrogant. You're summoning us. We have to go to you. If you really care, why don't you come to us? But now look at the next thing. Now look at verse 13. Hama'at, is it too little? Ki ha'elitanu me'eretz zavatu chalav udvash, that you took us out of a land of milk and honey. Lahamitenu bamidbar, to die in the desert. Ki tistarer aleinu gam histarer, that you try to prince, to lord over us. Aflo eretz zavat chalav udvash haviotanu. You have not brought us to a land of milk and honey, and have not given us an inheritance of a field and a vineyard. Will you knock out the eyes of those people? Now, I hope all of you see the sarcasm, right? How should I put it? Poison of the words here. And not only that, but how what they're saying over here is a total inversion. What is the land of milk and honey? Not the land of Israel. It's the land of Egypt. You claimed that you were going to bring us to a land of milk and honey, but in reality, you took us out of a land of milk and honey. Okay? You didn't give us anything. You didn't do anything for us. The only thing which you're doing is simply asserting your power over us. And you're trying to knock out our eyes. You're trying to blind us. You're trying to blind us in the sense of mislead us. So I just want you to see how this idea of the eyes come up over here, how I began the shir. You're trying to get us to see things, right, the wrong way. Okay? To make us believe, right, in other words, that we're going to a milk of honey when we're not. To make us think that we actually left the place of bondage, which was actually the land of milk and honey. Whose eyes are blind over here? Whose eyes have been knocked out? Now, Datan and Aviram, according to the rabbis, are the perpetual troublemakers in the Torah. In fact, according to the rabbinic understanding, which appears in a number of places, you're all familiar with the first time or the second time when Moshe goes out of the palace. He sees two Jews who are fighting. The rabbis say, Datan and Aviram. And not only that, but if you go back to chapter 3, chapter 2, in the book of Exodus, you'll see that when Moshe sees them fighting and says, why are you going to hit this person? And then the response is, who made you a judge? You are now, right, judging what we do? Who are you to be judgmental? Are you going to kill us? So it's not just that the Rabbi Stam associated Datan and Aviram with those two Jews who are fighting. The way they speak over there is the same way that they're speaking over here. And there seems to be a consistent line, which is they don't like being told what to do. Or in the words of some commentaries, they're anarchists. They dislike any type of leadership. Again, according to a rabbinic understanding, they're the people who, when Moshe tells them, on Shabbat there won't be any manna, don't go out and collect it, they dafka go out and collect it. So what do you see over here? Here are Datan and Aviram, who anything that Moshe could possibly say to them, could do to try to somehow diffuse the situation, they will completely turn it on its head. So now what I want you to see is that we actually have three different groups of people who are involved in this rebellion, who form what I would call an unholy coalition, unholy alliance. And by the way, it's not just my saying this is actually the Netziv. I have on the one hand Korach, who's motivated by power, who's motivated by status, who feels slighted. He's not the priest. And not only that, but this I didn't mention, so I'll mention it now. Even in chapter 3 of Numbers, when they do the census of the families of Levi, the prince of the family of Kahat is Elitzaphan ben Uziel. That should have been Korach. Korach feels, well, if he's not going to be Moshe, he's not going to be Aaron, at least let him be number 3. But he's not even number 3 in the chain of command. So that's offensive to him. Datan and Aviram, they're just anarchists. They don't like authority. The 250, they have a principle which they're fighting for, but the question is it really grounded in facts? Is it legitimate? Now, as we look at the continuation of the story, so yes, in the end, they do go through with the test. And I'll just skip for a moment, but before I skip, let's skip to the test. In verse 18, it says, and each one took their censer. They put in it fire. They put in the incense. They stand before the tent of meeting. And then Korach gathers the whole congregation to the tent of meeting. So again, remember I said to you that Korach is a politician? Korach wants everybody to be there. From beginning to end, he is doing the PR work to get everybody out there. This is going to be the grand spectacle, okay? And he wants everybody to witness it. He wants to make this the most public issue possible. And then what God says is, get the people away. And Moshe, in effect, prays to God and says, God, just because of one person, will you now attack the whole community? And then when we look a few verses afterwards, we see Datan and Aviram, who defiantly go to their tent, the entrance to their tent. Moshe comes to them. They didn't go to Moshe. Moshe comes to them. And what Moshe says to them is, you will see something now and realize, although it's not even for them, it's ultimately going to be for everybody who survives this, about what's going on over here, right, is an act of God. And essentially, we're all familiar with this. If the earth opens up its mouth and swallows you, then that's a sign that God is intervening over here. If you die naturally or don't die, so then God is not involved. And as we know in the story, yes, the earth opens its mouth, it swallows Datan and Aviram. Subsequently, or at the same time, fire comes out, consumes the 250 men. And according to rabbinic tradition, which is based on different verses, which I don't have the time to go into now, Korach actually is killed by fire which comes out and then swallowed up by the ground. So that he has the fate of both groups. Now, I mentioned to you that this whole story is actually a very troubling story. And it's actually a very dangerous story. Because Korach is a very, very charismatic leader. I also have a group of people who are raising what could be called a very serious, honest, ideological issue. Who is really able to serve God? What I'd like to do is to take 2 minutes and discuss a Mishnah, which appears in Pirkei Avot, which I imagine many of you are probably familiar with. This is chapter 5 in Pirkei Avot, depending on how you number it. In the Kahati edition, it's Mishnah 17. It says the following: Kol machloket, any argument, shehi l'shem shamayim, which is for the sake of heaven, sofo lehitkayem, in the end, it will be sustained. V'kol machloket she'no l'shem shamayim, and every argument which is not for the sake of heaven, sofo shelo lehitkayem. In the end, it will not be sustained. And then they say, what is an example of an argument for the sake of heaven? Hillel and Shammai. What's an example of an argument which is not for the sake of heaven? Korach and his followers. By the way, I hope everybody realizes what it actually should have said is Korach and Moshe, right? Because ostensibly they're the two sides to the argument. So already there are certain commentaries on the Mishnah who say, well, they couldn't have said Korach and Moshe because Moshe actually was arguing for the sake of heaven. It's only Korach and his followers who weren't for the sake of heaven. So what I'd like to speak about for the remaining time which I have is the issue of argument, disagreement. So the first thing which I would like to begin with is to say that disagreement in Jewish tradition is actually a very positive thing, right? There's always the classic joke about the two Jews with three opinions. And there seems to be something very Jewish about always arguing. It's actually positive. This is the essence of the Talmud. The Talmud is based on arguments, on discussions, on give and take, going back and forth. And not only that, but the idea of an argument for the sake of heaven, sofo lehitkayem, in the end being sustained, is actually saying that any argument which is for the sake of heaven will actually be perpetuated, will continue to exist forever. And to this day, right, in yeshivot, we constantly are studying the arguments of Hillel and Shammai, of the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai, which means that it wasn't out, even though the halacha was decided like Hillel, that Shammai was written out of the book. No, Shammai's opinion is still there, and it's important to study it. So what I'd like to do is examine, what does it mean to be arguing for the sake of heaven? And now I want to go back to what we just looked at, and just to highlight a few points, and to show you what was so problematic about Korach. So let's begin with the following. The first thing which is absolutely critical in arguing for the sake of heaven is that we argue about the issue. That at no point does the argument become ad hominem. At no point does a vicious attack against our opponent become a major part of our argument. If you want it to be for the sake of heaven, then you can't have it be an attack on a personal level. You have to stick to the issue. If I go back to Korach, when they initially say to Moshe, Lama titnasa'u, why do you lift yourselves up above the congregation? That is a personal attack. That's an accusation. When afterwards Datan and Aviram say, we will not go up to you, and they keep on emphasizing, why do you rule over us? Are you going to knock out our eyes? All of that is totally unacceptable in the realm of an argument for the sake of heaven. So forgetting about anything else that was being raised, that immediately disqualifies, undermines their argument the moment it takes on a personal level. The second thing is to what extent are your arguments grounded in facts? Or to what extent is it that you throw around all kinds of slogans, but they're not actually grounded in facts? If a person wants to make an argument, then that argument has to be seriously based in fact. And the less that it's connected with facts, the less credibility it will have, and the less it will be something that will be sustained. And that gets me to the third point. The first 2 points ultimately raise the question of what am I really interested in? An argument for the sake of heaven is ultimately interested in truth, in what is right. In our context, what is it that God ultimately would want to happen? There's a very big problem when ultimately what interests people is not really about what is truth and what is the right thing to do, but where there may be all kinds of what I would call hidden agendas. In the case of Korach, the hidden agenda is, it's not that everybody is equal. Yes, he's throwing around that beautiful slogan, but the bottom line is he wants to be the priest. Ultimately, what he wants is not that everybody should be equal. It's just that he doesn't like the person who has that position. In the case of Datan and Aviram, what they ultimately want is to not have to answer to an authority. They want to be the authority. And in the end, what this is saying is, if what you're looking for is not really truth, if what you're looking for is not really what is just and right, ultimately your case will not be sustained. It will be swallowed up by the ground, which is what happens in the case of Korach and his followers. I think today is we have a very real issue in Israel, in America, one might even say across the globe, of how do we actually engage in and disagree? And how do we conduct our discussions? And ultimately, what are we trying to gain? My feeling is that very often the discussions become power struggles. And that's not l'shem shamayim. Very often they become acrimonious. If we want to be able to really seek truth, justice, then we have to be able to now see that it's not just that we have a position, but the other side also has a position. To respect the other side, to not start throwing around all kinds of names. That doesn't further the discussion. The degree to which we are able to actually have respect, see what we actually can share in common, how ultimately we're looking for the greater good, in the end, that will actually bring about, a reality that can be sustained. And I want to end with a very interesting statement, which we actually say in the davening. At the very end of the tefillah, we have Tana Dvei Eliyahu, Kol Hashona Halachot B'chol Yom. Everybody who studies halacha every day has a portion of the world to come. But then it says, Talmidei Chachamim Marbim Shalom Ba'olam. Scholars increase peace in the world. What do scholars have to do with increasing peace? So Rav Kook has a very interesting explanation where he says, what do scholars do? As I mentioned before, scholars are constantly arguing with each other, but they're not arguing for the sake of arguing. They're arguing in order to be able to get to truth. In order to be able to get to truth, you have to be able to recognize that you don't have all the truth. Someone else may also have a truth. And how are you able to see the truth in the other person's position? How is he or she able to see the truth in your position? If everyone is able to somehow see that they don't have a monopoly on truth, but the people that they're arguing with also have a position. Now, it's true, at a certain point, we may have to decide one way or the other. But the way that we come to that decision is by having it actually discussed in all of its parameters and seeing all the different angles, and then having to weigh which side we come down on. Truth is based on being able to see the full picture. Truth is based on being able to get the maximum number of opinions and perspectives that can help me see that larger picture. But in order to be able to do that, there has to be a sense of camaraderie. There has to be a sense that we are all in it together. There has to be a sense of mutual respect. This was actually the problem in what happened with Korach and his followers. Had Korach and his followers come to Moshe and said to Moshe, look, Moshe, you are our leader. We respect you. You've taken us out of Egypt. You crossed us through the Red Sea. You gave us the Torah. You now set up this camp. We have the presence of God. Great. But we're bothered by certain things. We want to discuss it with you. Explain it to us. Here are concerns. How do you address that? There would have been a radically different result in the story. And what I would say is that Moshe would have had absolutely no problem discussing it. And Moshe would have been prepared to, I would even say more than that, to come towards Korach and his followers in every way, to meet them somewhere, to maybe find a way of alleviating their grievances. But there has to be a framework in which we realize we're all trying to get to the same point. But unfortunately, Korach and his followers set the parameters as being confrontational. Confrontational in a very ugly way. Confrontational in ultimately not necessarily getting to the truth, but getting to what my heart wants. Not necessarily is the truth and what is good and what is going to be the best solution for everybody. And from that perspective, their position is one that will never be sustained. We are in sore need of being able to find a language in which we can disagree and yet at the same time respect each other, where we can disagree and where we do it in a way which is ultimately trying to seek the greater good. Where we can disagree and not attack and not just try to promote our agendas, but to try to also see that there are other positions and to understand them as well. Each of us has to find our way of being able to do that. And I'll just also put a little plug. Pardes has a program. We have a center for conflict resolution. We have a whole program which is called Machloket Matters, as like it's important to argue. I would urge people to look it up on our website, okay? Because maybe the more that we find constructive ways of disagreeing, the better world we will have. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. And
Shabbat Shalom.
Yes, who would like to stay and disagree with me, so now's your opportunity.
Shabbat Shalom.
But only constructively.
Yes. Rabbi?
Yes.
Hi, it's Sandra in New York City. How are you?
Yes, Sandra. Very well, thank you.
Thank you. What a wonderful class. Whoa. But harking back right to the beginning, when you touched on the issue of Levav and the double vet, and you asked if maybe we can, if anyone can recall anywhere else in the Tanakh where we had the double vet and where we saw the Yetzer Hara coming to the fore. And
right.
we see it in Amnon and Tamar actually several times when he is basically attacking her. He rapes her.
Right.
And comes to him with levivot, pancakes. And, and she appeals to his heart as a brother. But of course, he is Latour, he is Taturing, Acharei Ha'einayim, and what was in his lev was pernicious and utterly immoral. And so he turned, I would argue that he turned that levivot that she was bringing to him with her lev, the proper Yetzer, as a healer, and he turned it, unfortunately and tragically, against her.
Yeah, fair. I think I like that very much. In other words, the levivot is actually appearing to his heart, but his like negative heart to be able to bring it around. Yes.
Yeah. Rabbi?
Yes.
Just a quick thing from the beginning of the Parasha. First of all, it was wonderful, everything that you said. But the beginning of the Parasha, where it speaks about Korach, and it says, Vayikach Korach, that it doesn't say what he took, indicates to me, because the first time it says something about someone, it's integral to who they are, that he's a grabby kind of guy.
I like that, yes. By the way, what you said actually fits in very nicely also, you know. In chapter 14 in Breshit, there's this whole story about a battle between 4 kings and 5 kings, and the coalition of the 5 kings are the king of Stone and his surroundings. And Abraham saves them. And then when Abraham brings back, right, all of the spoils of war and brings it to the king of Stone, so the king of Stone goes out to greet him. So Bracha, you know the first words that come out of his mouth?
What?
The first words that come out of the king of Stone's mouth is, give me.
It
doesn't matter what he says. He says, give me the souls, you take the money. But the very fact that the first word that comes out of his mouth is, give me, that says everything. So that would fit in with what you're saying about Korach. Korach is somebody who grabs, who takes. Yes, I like it.
Have to go. Thank you so much.
Rav Meir, this is
yes.
This is Ron.
Hi, Ron.
Hi. I have a question. Wasn't a rebellion to be expected, considering the fact that in the previous chapter, this entire generation was given a death sentence? They had nothing else. They had nothing to lose. They lost everything.
Well, they lost everything. So here I would say 2 things, right? And this gets you back to the whole question of, you know, how you look at things. Okay, because yes, there was this death sentence, but did anybody come to say to themselves, well, but why did that happen? And maybe it was because, you know, we were given the opportunity to come into the land of Israel. We were the ones who said, let's go back to Egypt. And that we brought it upon ourselves. And now we have to take responsibility for what we did. Maybe what they can also say is, but we were told that our children will come into the land. So let's now groom our children and get them ready for what's about to happen. In other words, what you're raising, Ron, I think on a purely human level, right, which is unfortunately what, happens all too often, is that when something happens, right, you automatically will blame the other side for what happened rather than take responsibility for what you did. And again, here I think it becomes really very clear when you see Datan and Aviram. Datan and Aviram say, you took us out of a land flowing with milk and honey, right? To have us die in this desert. You never gave us the land. It was all your fault. Wait a second, and what about the role of the Jewish people and what happened? So this is where I have my problem, that in other words, the minute that people are not able to look within themselves and to really even question themselves. By the way, this in terms of the point which I was bringing up about how do we engage in an argument or a discussion, how much is somebody prepared to be self-critical and to be prepared even to be critical of the arguments which they have? There are certain exercises that my daughter was.
I'll be willing to change your mind.
They did it in her school, where they want to create a debate between two people. So what they do is they have each side take the position which is totally opposite to what they would normally think.
Mhm.
And now I want you to present the case, right, for the other side, which is actually very challenging, which is really saying, can you actually see any case for the other side? Or how much is it you're so convinced about or can you see any flaws maybe in the case that you're making? Now, the truth is, if we had more people who would be willing to be self-critical and to be able to realize that, their case isn't exactly airtight, and to not always put the blame on the other side, but to maybe say, well, maybe I also need to take responsibility, we'd have a much better world. So on the one hand, what you're saying, Ron, from a purely real politique perspective, yes, of course, people in that situation, that's ripe for rebellion. But the hope is that maybe we'd be dealing with a different type of reality, a better type of reality, where maybe rather than just constantly, having to have power struggles, we'd be able to actually have people who, engage in, what is the right thing to do and how do I take responsibility for that? What I realize is that, the things which I'm advocating for will sound very naive and very idealistic. And
I know.
on the other hand, maybe that's what we need a little bit of.
Yes.
Mayor,
Thank you very much.
Mayor, it's Mark Friedman in Florida.
Hi, Mark.
And Leslie is sitting behind me. We'll miss you next week and the week after. I wanted to ask if there are any rabbinic interpretations of or thoughts or stories of Moses interceding with God to spare this gang of rebels after what they did.
Well, Moshe does intercede up to a certain point.
Right.
But you also see, which is very striking, which is, and I'd say extremely rare, that there's a certain point where it says, I skipped over that pasuk, where this is in chapter 16,
Okay.
pasuk. Let me just find it. In pasuk 15.
Mm-hmm.
In chapter 16:15, it says Moshe becomes angry. And Moshe actually says to God, don't accept their offering.
Mm-hmm.
And then he goes on to say, excuse me, he says, not one donkey did I ever lift up. I never harmed any of them.
Mm-hmm.
Which means that Moshe was extremely hurt by the language. How can you rule over us? And when Moshe is saying, I ruled over you, by the way, taking a donkey. So if you think about it today, right? In other words, you have the prime minister or you have the president, right? They either have in Israel, they have their Volvo, or else they'll have their Cadillac or whatever everybody else, right? So imagine saying, it's not that I didn't have a Cadillac or had a Volvo. I didn't have a Fiat. I didn't have, some sort of mini car, right? Just something big. I never asked. I never got paid anything. I never got any benefits. Did I ever in any way do harm to anybody, exploit my position. By the way, you should know that Samuel, when the people come and ask him for a king, says a similar thing, and he says it, just before he dies as well. Right. So this idea being, if you have certain people who are leaders, who really are, how should I put it, public service, are actually doing what they need to be doing, it's extremely hurtful to be accused of taking advantage. So it's one thing if you want to raise an issue, it's another thing. Don't attack me personally. And especially fabricate something which is completely removed from the reality. Right. And that's why I think here Moshe has kind of mixed feelings. Because, and essentially what Moshe feels is those people, as much as he's trying to somehow negotiate, speak to them, and if they're not willing to in any way come to meet him, so ultimately they become responsible for their fate. But what Moshe doesn't want to happen is to get the rest of the Jewish population sucked into this. By the way, I just want to bring up something which I didn't bring up in the shir, which maybe we can do it another time. But another major issue which comes out of this whole rebellion is something which today also is a very, very serious problem. And that's when you, quote unquote, mix religion and politics. And when you take certain religious issues and then make them political issues. And that's why, so according to the Netziv, who I mentioned before, he said that 250 people were actually motivated by real religious concerns. I mean, the way he puts it is, they wanted to be able to have that direct I thou encounter. Right. But the problem that you had over here is, they were essentially being manipulated by Korach, who was even using them as fodder in order to be able to further his political agenda, which was that he wanted to become the Kohen. So what happens when you have, certain people who have, legitimate causes, which they are, and they're very idealistic and believe in those causes, but then what happens is they somehow allow other people who are charismatic, who are political animals, to be the ones who run those causes and use them, but use them in a way which is ultimately promoting that person's political agenda rather than the actual cause. And so I'm saying, so this becomes a very real, and what happens, especially when you have people who are very charismatic, okay, who, rally people to a cause, when in fact they have a hidden agenda, which is to actually, promote, as I said, their political agenda. So that's where this, yes.
Sorry, this is Lynn in Texas. I'm sorry
Hi,
to
Lynn.
cut you off.
No, it's fine. Yes, Lynn.
Well, I'm trying to take a softer heart about last week's Parsha with the spies, because it's such a fascinating story, and I was always so angry with them. But this week, it seems that the grasshopperdom problem really affected everything that happened. Because, starting with the princes in this week's Parsha, who were also the wrongdoers last week. And
okay, but they're different people. I mean, we are talking about, I would say, different people.
Right, but there's still, there's an underlying presumption in everybody's argument, regardless of which of the three camps that they're in. Even though it's not spoken, there's this underlying presumption that they are somehow perceived as being less than, merely because they're ordinary Jews. So, I think it's a lot easier to be dignified and have humility when really in your soul you understand your importance, whatever your role is. And for people who have that, what I think is really a deep-seated insecurity, who see themselves as little, that's why they're projecting this on Moshe or on God, who not only did not say that they're little or unimportant, but everything in the Torah is telling us otherwise. So it just really seems like a manifestation of their own problems. And I think people have difficulty having meaningful arguments for the sake of heaven when they, again, interiorly are really not comfortable with who they are.
Okay,
So
I think
it's that that grasshopper-dom mentality has really pervaded the whole group think here.
Rabbi,
so. What
Rabbi, can I respond?
What you're saying, well, you want to respond to that? Okay, because I wanted to respond too.
Well, I want to respond to Lynn. This is Dennis Carr
Who's
in
speaking?
Charleston. And it brings up an issue. Lynn, perhaps the grasshopper syndrome is really more a reflection of the inability to accept responsibility. And if we think about the attraction of the demagoguery of Korach, he's saying, people, you don't have to be responsible because holiness is a status. You are holy because you've been declared we're all holy. But rather, holiness is becoming. What the Hebrew says is to become holy, not that we are holy. So the grasshopper is really just a capitulation, if you will, to this lack of responsibility. And that's why the demagoguery of Korach is so dangerous, and Moses have to address it. Unlike with Abiram, who just wants to return to Egypt, Moses realizes that he doesn't have to address it because it doesn't have any appeal to people, to Jews who have accepted the responsibility of Torah. But what Korach is doing, and what false messiahs have done throughout history, is says, and really the argument of Paul in Christianity is that you're automatically holy and you don't have to engage in any behaviors under the law.
Okay, you said a lot. So
human behavior and I'm trying to give people the benefit of the doubt, because if I were back then there, I don't know that I would have behaved so admirably. You know, it's really easy for me to be critical of my ancestors 3,000 years ago. I think that there are people who do want to take responsibility, but often when they see themselves as small, they have difficulty understanding where they fit in the big picture. So it becomes easy for them to get swayed by demagogues or real rulers.
See, Lynn, no, it's fine. What you're saying. So what I would say, I mean, I like what you're saying, and I would agree with you that, in other words, I think one thing about Judaism is that you always, try to always find the middle path, so to speak. And I think, in other words, what you were describing, it's like, going to two extremes. What do I mean by that? And as on the one hand, right, because I'm not really comfortable with myself and fully appreciate what I'm capable of doing, so there are two dangers. One danger is that I grossly overestimate what I'm capable of doing, and then feel very much, unhappy that well, why can't I be doing X, Y, and Z? Because, I really could be doing that, when you're not actually being honest with what you're capable of doing. And that's, I think, what's happening in the case of, Korach. And then the flip side of that is that you also can very much underestimate yourself and allow yourself to become overwhelmed. And so that, for a person who has what I would call a more healthy assessment of who they are and what they're capable, and also has a positive feeling about who they are, so they won't go to the extreme of being overwhelmed, and they also won't go to the extreme of imagining they're much more than what they really are. And I think, so if I understood you right, I mean, I think there does seem to be a very basic human problem of people not necessarily being, and accepting who they are and making the most of who they are. And I think that, which means sometimes you can sell yourself short, And sometimes it could be that you maybe how should I put it, exaggerate what you're capable of. And that's a challenge. That's a challenge for everybody. And I think that's why, one of the things that, so Lynn, I'm sure you're familiar with this, right? Why I always talk about the idea of majesty and humility. That in other words, that people have to have that sense of majesty to begin with, but they also have to know how to balance it and to know what their limitations are. But you start off with the idea that you are majestic, that in other words, if you're a human being and you're in the image of God, that you really do have capabilities. And by the way, I would just add that, in other words, that many people don't even realize what they're capable of until they're put into certain situations and they actually are able to produce in those situations. So sometimes people really do sell themselves short. And that's why I think I said it, I may have said it last week, but I certainly believe it, that in other words, that if a person believes they really are in the image of God and they believe in God, then that should also give you that feeling of majesty and a feeling that, in other words, that you really do have all kinds of capabilities. But at the same time, you also have to know what your limitations are. And then I agree with you that I think that's the story, not only of the Jewish people in the desert, that's the story of all of human history, that people constantly are searching or who they are, and very often, okay, they'll go to either extreme rather than somehow be in the middle. And so what I mentioned during the shir, which I think is, so again, when Ron brought up the question about, well, the situation is one which is ripe for rebellion, right? So then, if you again go back to Parashat Shlach, the Jewish people, when they were given the opportunity to go into the land, so then they started complaining. They said, we won't go into it, right? And they're demoralized with the spies. So then Moshe comes and says, okay, you're going to die in the desert because, you had the opportunity. So then the people all of a sudden said, you know what? We're sorry. We're ready to go now. And then Moshe says to them, too late, you can't go. No, we're going to do it now. You can't go. And you have to, and then what happens is a group of people decide they want to go in, and then they're totally devastated. Which means that people also have to be able to appreciate, in other words, what are the parameters within which you work, and to realize, I think it's true, and in this case, sometimes you get certain opportunities, you miss it, and then once you miss it, that's it. You won't get that opportunity again. And then you'll have some people who will then spend the rest of their life, right, just bemoaning the fact that they missed that opportunity, and then be angry at the whole world. And there are some people who will say, okay, I missed the responsibility. And then Dennis, so if it's what you said is, so then maybe at a certain point you missed an opportunity, take responsibility for it, now make the best of that situation and realize that maybe you can actually make the best of a certain situation. So yes, it won't be ideally what might have been, but still there could be a tremendous amount that you could do. So even if you have a whole generation which is about to die out in the desert, but for that period of time that they're still alive, they can still now not only, function to the best of their ability, but maybe if they had the foresight to be able to now raise their children and groom the next generation to not make the mistakes which they did, which I think about a lot, that whenever there are mistakes that I may have made in my life, so at least let me be able to convey that to my kids, okay, based on my own experience, that don't make those mistakes, right? No, it's at least, I've learned that lesson, so let me at least get you to be able to see something that, that it would have been helpful if I would have been able to see beforehand. So that's, that's my take on it. But again, all of this, if you think about it, is actually very challenging. It's very demanding because it is telling people, it's forcing people to have to be honest with themselves. It's forcing them to have to take responsibility for what they do. It's forcing them to be able to accept, and not only accept reality, but to be able to see what I even say the infinite potential of a reality. Which means that, in other words, whatever reality you find yourself in, there still could be a tremendous amount that you could be doing in that reality. And I think that sometimes that's part of the problem, that people, always imagine that, well, if I would be in a different reality, then I'd be able to actually, do something. But in this reality, what can I do? But maybe you have to be able to say to yourself, at a certain point, it doesn't really matter. Whatever reality I'm in, there's so much that I could be doing. And regardless of who I am, there's so much that I could be doing. So then why don't I now do that? And it all has to do with what you set up as seeing as being maybe important in life, and and how do you make that happen? Okay, for whatever it's worth, that's my take on it.